Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Picture this for a second. It is 1914, and you have this massive, incredibly tragic collision about to happen. You've got 19th century military tactics sprinting headfirst into 20th century industrial technology. Today, we're unpacking the clash that completely upended warfare forever. We are going to explore exactly how rapid technological advancements, I mean everything from rapid-fire machine guns to the very first tanks and aircraft, totally turned the battlefields of World War I into a completely unrecognizable landscape of just pure industrial destruction.
And to truly grasp what that destruction actually looked like, we have to start right here. Lieutenant Montague Cleve of the Royal Garrison Artillery recalled it like this. He said, "We found we literally couldn't walk among the trenches without treading on dead bodies, German and British." It's a visceral, deeply horrifying quote, isn't it? But it perfectly captures the reality on the ground. This simply wasn't the kind of war anyone had prepared for. The technology had completely outpaced the tactics, and the men on the ground, well, they paid the ultimate price.
Okay, let's dive into this deadly disconnect. We really have to look at the mindset back in 1914. Generals were still operating on this sort of Napoleonic romanticism. They fully anticipated a war of movement, complete with glorious cavalry charges and infantry marching in these bright, colorful uniforms. British General Sir Douglas Haig famously fantasized about these vast cavalry sweeps. But the industrial reality waiting for them on the battlefield, it was brutally different. The immense firepower of modern technology meant that stepping out into the open to charge the enemy was, well, it was nothing short of a death sentence.
The biggest, most brutal wake-up call to all that romanticism really boils down to just one number: 600. That is the number of rounds per minute that the British Vickers machine gun could fire. Early models were incredibly heavy, they required 3 to 6 men just to operate them, but man, as defensive weapons, they were an absolute killing machine. Machine guns were responsible for a third of all battlefield casualties, and they were lethal at a range of over a kilometer. The whole concept of an open infantry offensive was instantly rendered completely suicidal.
So, to survive this terrifying new rapid-fire reality, armies basically had only one choice. They had to dig. The sheer lethality of being exposed to modern artillery and machine gun fire directly forced the creation of the vast, incredibly muddy trench networks that absolutely defined the Western Front. The trench wasn't some kind of strategic masterstroke, not at all. It was just a desperate reaction to a battlefield where standing up meant getting shot down.
What emerged from all this digging was a defensive nightmare. Daily life in these trenches was a brutal, exhausting mix of dull routine, freezing mud, and absolute terror. The front lines were backed by support and reserve trenches, and they were all fortified with sandbags and duckboard flooring. And to protect these trenches, armies laid down thick belts of barbed wire. It is deeply ironic, honestly, that a cheap agricultural invention designed for cow fencing became a weapon of mass slaughter. But it was incredibly effective. It was highly resistant to artillery and absolutely deadly to attacking infantry. And because the daytime was just too dangerous, soldiers had to rely on the cover of darkness. They would venture out into no man's land for nighttime patrols just to spy on the enemy and desperately repair those vital barbed wire entanglements.
With the front lines completely locked in place, generals had to shift their tactics away from movement and towards pure attrition. German Chief of Staff General Erich von Falkenhayn methodically embraced this. He relied on defensive tactics that he literally called a mincing machine. The object wasn't necessarily to gain ground anymore. It was just to bleed the enemy white. Like at the Battle of Verdun, Falkenhayn knew the French would defend the town to the bitter end, so he purposely designed a battle to inflict maximum casualties. The horrific goal? Simply grind the opposing army to dust. To fuel this kind of attritional warfare, artillery needed a massive upgrade. Back in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, cannons lacked recoil mechanisms. That meant every single time you fired, the gun rolled back, and artillerymen had to spend all this time and energy rolling it forward and re-aiming it. But by 1914, the invention of barrel recoil brakes with hydraulic shock absorbers changed everything. Suddenly, artillery could fire up to 20 rounds a minute without ever needing to be re-aimed. It was a terrifying multiplier of destructive force. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer, staggering industrial scale of this new warfare. 7 million. That is the number of shells fired by the Royal Artillery at the Somme between July and September of 1916 alone. Just incredible. Heavy artillery and high-explosive shells quickly became the most dominant weapons of the war. This created massive logistical challenges, obviously, leading to serious shell shortages that forced entire nations to rapidly convert their domestic factories just to pump out endless streams of ammunition. All this mass artillery quite literally pulverized the environment. Just look at the immense Lochnagar crater here. That was created by explosive underground mines. The continuous shelling turned the landscape into this convulsed, dead moonscape. And it wasn't just physical destruction we were talking about here, it was a profound psychological trauma. Living under the constant, deafening roar of artillery for weeks at a time caused intense mental strain. In fact, post-war, 65,000 British ex-soldiers drew disability pensions specifically for neurasthenia, which is what we know today as shell shock. This sheer volume of unprecedented trauma forced battlefield medicine to rapidly evolve, birthing modern triage, blood transfusions, and even early facial reconstruction, really just to keep pace with the unimaginable carnage.
So, this brings us to a massive tactical puzzle. How do you break an unbreakable line? Seriously, when both sides are dug into deep trenches, protected by millions of sandbags, endless fields of barbed wire, and rapid-fire machine guns, how on earth does an army move forward? It was this exact permanent stalemate that pushed the scientists, the chemists, and the engineers of the early 20th century to innovate in some of the most desperate and terrifying ways imaginable.
In that desperation, birthed the horrors of chemical warfare. The Germans, who had the most advanced chemical industry in the world at the time, introduced chlorine gas at Ypres in 1915. It was a heavy vapor that essentially destroyed respiratory organs. Then came phosgene, an asphyxiator that actually caused less coughing, which meant soldiers unknowingly inhaled much more of it before they even realized what was happening. But perhaps the most infamous was mustard gas, introduced in 1917. Now, it wasn't really a gas at all, but a volatile liquid that caused severe internal and external blistering hours after contact. And in those early days, before proper masks were mass-produced, soldiers were desperately urinating on rags just to breathe through the chlorine clouds. It is truly horrific to think about.
British Major General Charles Foulkes put it perfectly when he said, "The appearance of gas changed the entire character of warfare." Even though gas was responsible for only about 4% of total battlefield deaths, mostly due to the rapid development of gas masks, its impact was profound. It quite literally weaponized the air soldiers breathed. It forced men to fight in blinding, suffocating masks. It seeped into their food and their clothing, and it added an immense layer of psychological terror to a daily routine that was already nearly unbearable.
So if chemicals couldn't permanently break the lines, perhaps mechanics could. Enter the tank. Developed in absolute secrecy and actually shipped under the disguise of quote-unquote water tanks to confuse enemy spies, these machines were heavily influenced by commercial tractors. They were designed to do exactly what infantry couldn't do: cross trenches, crush barbed wire, and absorb small arms fire. They were even split into male tanks equipped with artillery cannons and female tanks armed with machine guns to target infantry. It was a brilliant conceptual leap to bring fire, maneuver, and protection all together in one package.
So the crucial point is, early on, these machines were a complete logistical nightmare. Out of 59 British tanks in France before the Battle of Flamethrowers in 1916, 17 broke down before they even reached the battlefield. That's a huge failure rate. They were agonizingly slow, mechanically super unreliable, and basically a massive easy target for German field artillery. While they definitely caused initial panic, it would take years of refinement and totally new tactical doctrines before tanks could be massed in the hundreds to finally have a decisive impact at places like Cambrai. Now, while the soldiers were bogged down in the mud, another incredible technological leap was happening right above them. The airplanes of 1914 were essentially just converted civil craft. They were fragile, lacked power, and honestly, they were originally dismissed by many military leaders as just a dangerous hobby. Initially, these unarmed planes were used for one primary purpose, and that was reconnaissance. Pilots would fly over enemy lines, spot artillery targets, take photographs, and reportedly even wave at enemy pilots passing by on similar missions.
Let's move on and see how this builds, because that friendly waving certainly didn't last long. The arms race in the air was incredibly rapid. To stop enemy reconnaissance, planes needed weapons. The real game-changer here was a Dutch invention called the synchronization gear, which was famously used on the Fokker plane. Basically, it allowed a machine gun to fire right through the spinning propeller without shooting the blades off. That single invention created the first true fighter planes. And by the end of the war, this evolution birthed massive multi-engine strategic bombers, like the British Handley Page and German Gothas, which are actually capable of carrying massive payloads across borders.
But, despite the highly publicized and romanticized dogfights of famous pilots like the Red Baron, the true strategic impact of aviation in World War I was gathering intelligence. That aerial reconnaissance spotted massive troop movements and guided indirect artillery fire with devastating precision. In fact, early on, It was this exact aerial spotting that recognized a gap in the advancing German lines, which directly led to the decisive Allied victory at the First Battle of the Marne, stopping a swift German victory right in its tracks.
And of course, communicating all that vital intelligence required another major leap, and that was wireless telegraphy. Before the war, armies were highly skeptical of wireless because it was heavy, unreliable, and super easily intercepted. But when the British immediately cut Germany's submarine communication cables in 1914, the Germans were forced to heavily integrate wireless technology. And speaking of beneath the waves, this same period saw the terrifying rise of the U-boat, weaponizing submarines to basically choke off enemy supply lines. Above ground, as trench warfare locked into that static defensive posture, it became totally practical to erect permanent wireless stations on the battlefield, making it possible to coordinate massive barrages and actually organize the chaos of the modern front.
So by 1918, the static trenches were finally giving way to the mobile, mechanized warfare that we would recognize today. The dreadful deadlock forced humanity to innovate in unprecedented ways, giving us tanks, fighter planes, chemical weapons, advanced communications, and incredible leaps in trauma medicine. Which leaves us with a pretty haunting question. Did the weapons forged to end the terrible stalemate of World War I simply guarantee that the next war would be fought with a speed, scale, and ruthlessness that was even worse? It's a profound thought to take away with you today. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the history that shapes our world.